This morning we're talking about cohesion and related issues in writing. So last Friday morning we talked about coherence, which is the flow of thoughts, the flow of ideas, the flow of sentences and clauses. Today we're talking about cohesion, and these two do overlap a little bit. And cohesion has to do with the flow of words and wording. And if you see a word, can you really connect it with the context? For example, that's cohesion. And then this afternoon we'll talk about using sources, touch on paraphrasing a little bit more, and also source citation systems and such. So referring to the handout, of course, one aspect of cohesion we've touched on before has to do with, say, when you repeat a word or an idea. So you're writing and you need to refer to something again. And there are different ways of doing this to maintain cohesion. Of course, you can repeat keywords, or you can use paraphrases or synonyms. And you can also use pronouns. Now, this really varies according to the writing style in your field somewhat, and so you need to be aware of what's the more common device in your field. So in some fields it's common to repeat keywords, especially technical terms, and sometimes that's unavoidable. Or to use paraphrases or synonyms, especially in humanities writing, for example. You're trying to really show, it's really important, especially for example in literature fields, if you're doing literature analysis, to really show that you are really skilled at using language artfully, because that's really important in, say, humanities writing, to connect to your reader and to explain concepts and to express nuances. And so you might use synonyms, so in like 1.2, synonyms, apparatus, such a device, migrated, travel, trek, things like that. And in humanities writing especially, it's quite common to use these paraphrases or synonyms and such to avoid repeating words, but also to express further nuances and show how good a writer you are. In some fields it may be more common just to repeat words again. Especially in science and technical writing. So you may not be able to really find usually suitable paraphrases or synonyms. You could say, you know, the interferometer, and then you could say this device, this apparatus. To some degree, yes, you can use synonyms or paraphrases. Not a whole lot of flexibility when you're dealing with science terms. The nanotubes and, you know, this substance, perhaps sometimes. In some fields it might be more common to use pronouns where it's clear, but again in say science writing you're kind of more limited. You can't use pronouns as often in science and engineering writing, math and such. So in science writing, if you say it, you know, it could be really ambiguous in the context. What does it refer to? Because you're referring to a number of different topics, a number of different things. And so in a given context, it could refer to, you know, carbon or boron or nanotube or buckyball, or it could be a lot of things depending on the context. And so it, pronouns like that tend to be vague references. Those are personal pronouns: he, she, it, they, these. And you have sometimes these, those might be used. Sometimes they sound better. Sometimes it might sound better to say this, that, these, those, rather than it, because it sounds more specific. If you're talking about something in the immediate context, that might be better. We also have indefinite pronouns. Those are things like someone, something, somewhere, anyone, anything, anywhere, everything, everywhere, everyone, nothing. Those are indefinite pronouns. And those are kind of more informal or colloquial style, and we tend not to use those as much in academic writing. And so you probably won't see those much in academic writing. Instead of saying somewhere, you want to use something more specific and cool sounding, like a certain location. Instead of someone, you might want to say, you know, the survey respondents or the experimental participants instead of someone, or members of this population instead of a vague term like someone. And so you probably want to look at the writing in your field and see what are the cohesive devices used for repeatedly referring to things and concepts. Is it more so keyword repetition, synonyms, paraphrases, maybe pronouns? Probably you won't see it or they as much, but maybe more commonly this or that in particular contexts. Also under 1.3, I'm moving on to page 2. I'm not going to talk through everything because some of this stuff is a little dry. But here, the example starting from the bottom of page 1 and page 2. In this example here, I want to point out a common mistake that I see Korean writers using. So, some computer's doing something weird. So here, like this example says, many universities focus on blah blah blah, and at the top of page 2, this, where I've written this, but what a lot of Korean writers will do is they will write what pronoun will they use? They will often write it, but in this case it is not very clear. So in this case, Korean writers will often use it in a way that's not very clear. So where I've got this underlined in number 1, 2, and 3 on page 2, these are cases where I have seen Korean writers using it. Now it refers to a specific thing in the context, but in this case, is the writer referring to a specific thing, a specific noun in the immediate context? No. What is the writer referring to? A whole sentence, or the idea of a whole sentence or a whole clause. And so if I say it, you may have learned this term in your grammar classes, the antecedent, or linguists prefer the term referent, what the term refers to. So it is for a personal referent or an object referent, the referent or the antecedent that it refers to. But in this case, you're not referring to a thing, an object, or a person. It's not a personal or object referent or antecedent. It is a discourse referent. A discourse referent. Discourse meaning, you know, the text or the conversation or the writing of the ideas. The discourse referent, that is a sentence, a clause, or the idea of that sentence or clause is what the pronoun refers to. And so often Korean writers will use it in this kind of case when you should use this. Sometimes that, but this often works better. It sounds more specific and, you know, relevant. Another way to think of it is if you could paraphrase it by saying this situation. You could say this situation or just this. So like in number 1, this as in this situation, this circumstance. And you could say this situation ultimately does not serve the students, or you could just say this. Likewise in number 2, this fact, this happening, this situation, or this conclusion, this decision, whatever is rejected. Number 3, this is kind of similar, the lack of research, and it's kind of, it lacks so number 3, when the student writer says the lack of research, it doesn't really have cohesion with the previous sentence. The previous sentence is talking about lack of research. And so in the next sentence, if you just say the lack of research, it implies maybe you're talking about something that was further back or something new. But if you say this lack of research, it's more clear you're referring to the situation of the previous sentence. The previous sentence talks about few studies have examined their combined effects. So it would make more sense to say this lack of research. If you say the lack of research in this context, it's not very clear. It lacks cohesion with the wording and the idea of the previous sentence or the previous idea. So these are common Korean mistakes, probably also Japanese and Chinese mistakes too, because there are a lot of similarities in their difficulties with English. Relative clauses. Okay, so relative clauses are a common one. I've got a number of examples here. Let me just give you a simplified example. a simpler one that's what's in the examples here. Let's say I'm talking about my brother who lives in Texas. Will come for Christmas. Come to visit us for Christmas. So this is a normal relative clause. This is the more common kind that you're used to. What happens if I do this? Sorry. What if I put commas around it? How does that change the meaning? It changes the meaning. How does it?
Not any of your brothers, but the one who lives in Texas. The stress is on the one who lives in Texas.
Okay. So if I leave out the commas, that actually indicates the one who lives in Texas. But what if I put in commas? It's a different kind of relative clause. How is this different?
More than one brother, but if I added a comma, I have just one brother.
Yeah, so it would imply either I have only one brother, or maybe you know about this brother already, and I don't need to identify him, I'm just adding more information. So this is the normal relative clause, and this is like the relative clause in Korea. What would be, how do you say text? In Korean you say, my brother in Texas living. It's basically a participle. So my in Texas living brother. Yeah, that's how you do it in Korean. That's the normal relative clause that you're used to. This kind. Your grammar books, well, at least the English grammar books, use an old term that's not very helpful. They call it a restrictive relative clause. That's not a very clear term. It's an old term. It's like if you have a set of things and it restricts it to, these are possible brothers, and it restricts it to this one. A more modern term that's more helpful is identifying relative clause. This is an identifying relative clause. It identifies which one, like which brother. This is the normal relative clause. Now English has a second kind. It's not as common, but you do see it sometimes, especially in narrative and academic writing. This kind, it's a non-identifying clause. I don't need to identify the brother. I'm just adding more information. And so in writing, we use commas. In speech, there would also be a difference in the sentence pronunciation. So this would be, my brother who lives in Texas will come for Christmas. But if I do this kind, I would put in a break. My brother who lives in Texas. So there's kind of a break or rising intonation here. My brother who lives in Texas. My brother who lives in Texas. Bit more of a break will come for Christmas. And so the commas represent that kind of break or intonation in spoken English. And in Korean, you don't have a relative clause like this. I think in Korean, from what my students tell me, you'd have to just change the phrasing. My brother lives in Texas and he will come for Christmas, or my brother will come for Christmas and he lives in Texas. I guess in Korean you have to completely rephrase it because you don't have this kind of thing in English. So this is less common, but you do see it fairly regularly in academic writing, in narrative writing. Grammatically, this would be just the same as saying, for example, my brother, the one in Texas, or the one who lives in Texas, it would be just like that. My brother, the one in Texas, will come for Christmas, or maybe you know about him already, or I could say my brother, the programmer. Let's say that he's a programmer. My brother, the programmer, It's just adding more information about the brother, and that's all it is. And so sometimes when I proofread papers by Koreans, academic papers, I see sometimes these comma errors. They leave out a comma. When that following phrase is adding, it's not identifying the item, but it's simply adding more information. And that leads to a lack of cohesion if you make a comma mistake here. Because back to the relative clause, the who, it changes the meaning. If you leave out the comma, it changes the meaning. If it should be the non-identifying clause, like my brother who lives in Texas, and you say that my brother who lives in Texas, it's a different meaning, especially when you're talking about technical stuff, technical things in your field.
Is it for me then less risky than to skip the commas? If I'm not very sure whether the content I'm saying is right.
Is it less risky? It's probably, yeah, it might be usually less risky to leave out the commas if you're not sure. Yeah. If possible, ask yourself, is this identifying which one? Or you can paraphrase it without a relative clause like this, like my brother or the one in Texas. Try paraphrasing it without the relative clause and see, does this just add more information, or is this identifying which one? Does this point out to the reader which one? So there are two tests you can like that. So that's kind of a common problem. Another common problem with relative clauses I see Koreans do, 2.3, descriptor phrases with where in writing, Koreans will often use a relative clause when you don't need it. It's not necessary. So at the top of page 3, okay, moving on. Korean writers, for example, I've seen this in proofreading, we identify patients who had mild symptoms of hypertension. Unless you really need to emphasize the fact that they possess this condition, it's more common in English, and it flows better if you say patients with mild symptoms. When you're talking about descriptions, when you can use a with for a description instead of who had, because if you do that who had, that adds extra structure and it takes longer for the reader to process, which thus emphasizes the fact that they possess this condition. So if you don't need to emphasize that, it often flows better to use with when you're writing descriptions for descriptive phrases. This is true so this is in narrative writing and in academic writing. Likewise, number 2, East Asian students often use relative clauses that have, and I could make it easier by saying relative clauses with have as the main verb. Students who had an intrinsic interest, students with an intrinsic interest, or sometimes using the verb have, it's a very common verb, and sometimes you can replace it with a more interesting verb like students who showed an intrinsic interest or exhibit an interest or such. Or a participle phrase, students exhibiting, showing an intrinsic interest. So sometimes that sounds better. So these are little things that affect the flow of wording. Making a relative clause adds extra structure and it takes a little more time to process for the reader. Okay, now my favorite thing, definite and indefinite articles. Perhaps this is what you're waiting for. This is really tricky because, well, you've read grammar books, grammar textbooks, grammar reference books that probably gave you rules for articles. Did those rules ever help you? Why not? Why are they so unhelpful? One, they're very simplistic rules. Two, those materials tend to be written by people who don't really know much about linguistics. Three, linguists don't fully understand how these things work. I mean, it's a bit of a mystery for linguists, exactly how do these things work. Because it involves some really abstract things like something that's specific or definite, and those are really hard things to quantify and explain in a way that's really intuitive, and especially in a way that we can then explain to language learners. So linguists don't fully understand it. Those who do have some understanding are unfortunately not the ones who are writing your grammar books. Your grammar books are being written by people with minimal linguistic knowledge who want to sell books, or publishing companies that want to sell books. And so the publishing, the materials are often commercially driven, and you don't really have real linguistics experts writing them. And even the linguistics experts don't know how to translate their theoretical knowledge into something practical for students. So if you do have a linguist, a real linguist writing it, they don't know how to translate it into something that normal people can understand. So I'm working on a system that is hopefully, that's based on a different, more recent approaches, more recent linguistic theories, and trying to translate it into something practical. So let me try this. Let me ask you some questions. Can you say in English a water? Oh, really? Can you say a coffee? A latte? Yes, you can go to a coffee shop and say, give me a latte. Give me a coffee. Yes. Or if you're ordering one of these, you could say, give me a water. You could say, give me water, or you could say, give me a water. What's the difference? Yeah, so if I say a water, then it means a particular quantity or container. A bottle of water, a cup of water. Just like I say, give me a coffee, give me a latte, that means a cup of coffee or a cup of latte. I found that a lot of Koreans are actually confused about this. You probably have been trained in a very rule-like way. There's one correct way to do it with articles, and it's not the case. Sometimes you have options, and it's not like one noun either takes articles or doesn't take articles. That's not the case. It depends sometimes on the meaning that you want to convey, or the nuance. You can express different nuances or meanings sometimes. So some nouns will prefer, or more often tend to take articles or not take articles. But there's some flexibility, some interchangeability, because we can express other nuances. How about support? Article or no article? More often no article. Why?
Because you're not countable.
It's not countable usually, but well, even though it's not countable though, how about this? I need the support of all of my employees. Yeah, it's not exactly countable, but it does take the. Not because it's countable here, you can't count supports, but it does become definite. I need the support of all of my employees. I could talk about support in another way. The bridge is held up by columns, which we can also call a support. So the support collapsed. The support cracked, the bridge support cracked, and the bridge fell down. You know. So support more often is abstract. I just say I need support. I need some support. But I can make it more specific. It's not countable, but it's more specific. I need the support of all my employees. And so this is what I'm kind of graphing out here. You have in black maybe the more common or default usages, but sometimes they can take on other meanings. So the nouns that are most often countable are object nouns, nouns that refer to objects. A pen, the pen. A pen or the pen. And it's an object, and therefore it's countable, and countable nouns have a or the. So countable nouns are most often object nouns. However, if I want to talk about pens in general, in English, what do? We make it plural with no article, pens. I like red pens. I hate green pens, for example. I'm talking about pens in general. The water example, water and coffee, more commonly these are nouns that refer to substances or a mass of something. So I like coffee, I like water, I like tea, for example. I like to play with silicon in my experiments. But you can take that kind of noun and you can then put an article on it and turn the meaning into something different, where you're talking about a specific type, a specific quantity. Give me a coffee, or give me the crystalline silicon, something like that. I can talk about a particular type. The waters of Mars. It's a science fiction episode with that title, The Waters of Mars, the waters of Earth. We're talking about different types of waters, like oceans and lakes and rivers, the waters of Earth, and such, or the water of Earth as opposed to like the type of water on Earth as opposed to the water of Mars, the water that's found on the planet Mars. So, and the water that is not on Venus anymore, because all the water on the planet Venus seems to have escaped. So I can put an article on it and change the meaning. So this is the more common use, but I can put an article on it and get a different meaning or nuance. And it depends really on the nuance you want to express in the context. In some contexts, you could go either way depending on your preference. And I'll come to some in a minute. I just thought of an example I need to write down here. How about bungee jumping? Article, no article. Like, I like bungee jumping. No article. But if I said, that was a great bungee jump. Now the noun form is different, but a jump. That was a really great bungee jump. And if you're stressed as grad students, I really recommend going to Yultongongwan and doing a bungee jump there. It's a great stress release. It's really fun. So I can talk about bungee jumping, more general or abstract now, like a general activity, or I could talk about a particular event or instance. That was a great jump. I had a really great jump there. And now I'm going to try a higher jump somewhere else. Most bungee jumps are 45 meters. There's one down over in Korea. What is it? There's some place. Where is it? Saemyeongdae. Where's it? What's that town? It's Saemyeongdae. It's not Yeosu. It's anyway. There's a 60-meter bungee jump. I want to try someday. Anyway. Okay, so we could talk about a general activity. I like bungee jumping. I like swimming. I like skiing. General activity. To talk about a particular event, particular instance. It can become a or the. That was a great jump. I had a great swim. I had a great jog this morning. Something like that. How about states of properties like redness? Let's take redness. Article, no article. If I'm talking about redness, the word redness, for example. Article or no article? What's your preference? Okay, no article, you prefer no article, some of you, because it tends to be abstract, an abstract noun and meaning. Redness could be a symptom of a skin disease, for example. Redness. But I could talk about a particular instance of redness, like the redness of your face concerns me. The redness of your face concerns me. So they're talking about a particular instance, a particular type or example. And so, these kinds of things can then become more specific with an article. And one thing that often makes them specific, more specific, is what's called a post modifier. So a normal modifier is an adjective, like an adjective you put before a noun, like a red pen. But there are post modifiers that come after the noun, like a prepositional phrase. So for example, the redness of your face, where of your face is an expression that modifies redness. So not always, but often that's a clue that it is more specific, a post modifier. A prepositional phrase like a descriptive of phrase, maybe a relative clause, maybe a participle phrase after the noun. Not always, but it can make it more specific. It depends on the context, but more often. I need the support of all my employees. Of all my employees, post modifier indicates a particular type or a particular instance, particular example. The redness of your face, for example. How about this is another example. Feminism. Article or no article? Okay, so a lot of nouns are clearly in the abstract category. They're just abstract, meaning most often no article, but I could, for example, put a post modifier on it. I can make it more specific. The feminism of Virginia Woolf. The feminism of the 19th century American abolitionists, because actually feminism came out of the American abolition movement and was sparked by religious ideas, actually, originally. Religious people opposed to slavery and discrimination. So the feminism of the 19th century abolitionist, the feminism of modern Germany, for example. If I talk about a specific type, instance, example, I can make it more specific, and I can express different nuances. So this is kind of the system that I've been identifying and working on. I hope to someday develop some more teaching materials, and so maybe if you come back to my website in a couple of years, I'll have something more specific. But hopefully this is more meaningful than the nonsense in your grammar books. Because their grammar books tell you a bunch of rules that don't work. I've tried them. I tried teaching those kinds of rules, and I found, no, it doesn't work. Most of the time, it doesn't work. So I found some more recent work in linguistics that take a different approach. As you look at, for example, I've got an example here on page 3 where I've gone through some sample writings and I've corrected them. I struck out some things. I've tried to make some corrections. So, for example, in number 1, if I have a square brackets around it, it means that's where I inserted something that was missing from the original. These are Korean writers, by the way. And if you take a look at maybe where I inserted some, where I struck out some, maybe talk with a neighbor for a minute and see if you can see what particular cases. So for example, in number 1, post modifiers often, not always, they don't always make a noun more specific. They often do, but there's a case in number 1 where they don't necessarily, or it doesn't work that well. But as you look at these, try to identify maybe the types of nouns that are more problematic, where I made corrections here. So again, if I, where I had to insert something, I have square brackets around it. And others that are mistakes I struck out. Sometimes I have things in parentheses where maybe it's optional when I put it in there. So talk with a neighbor for maybe a minute. See if you can identify the types of nouns that are more problematic, the types of nouns that Koreans tended to have difficulty with. There's a lot in here, and we won't have time to really cover this in detail because we could spend hours on this, and if you really want to torture yourself, you can do that at home with this kind of stuff. Did you notice any patterns in these problems? Or some questions you had about my corrections?
I wanted to find out. In certain instances, seems to be, I've seen that, and then seems, how are they different?
Okay, I'm sorry?
like in sentence, sometimes you might find a phrase like seems or seems to be. I've seen all of that.
Okay, well, it's kind of a different issue, but he seems, but he seems anxious, where you have an adjective after that. He seems to be anxious either way, but he seems to be, if you need a verb or something to complete the idea, you'd use a to be. He seems to be hiding something or something. Okay, well, it's kind of a different issue. With the articles, do you have any questions? Or was there anything you noticed? Okay, I'm not going to go through all of this in detail because it is kind of boring. But in number one, a deeper understanding where the of makes it more specific. It's a post modifier. What understanding? An understanding of this issue. So in that case, a post modifier, so many times a post modifier is more specific. It's kind of like the identifying relative clause where it identifies which brother. In this case, it's identifying what kind of understanding. So there, it works to have an article, and this is the first time you've mentioned it, so A. But notice in line 3 of number 1, the observational data, where maybe data is more like this kind of thing, I guess. But here it doesn't seem to, as a native speaker, my intuition is to strike out the. You don't really need the. It's not really incorrect, but it's just not necessary. Where observational data of classroom behavior, where one, you're talking more generically and abstractly, because classroom behavior here is abstract and it's mentioned for the first time. Observational data is abstract. In this case, it doesn't seem that the of phrase is really identifying. It's more modifying, but I'm not sure if it's really identifying a particular set of, because you're not really referring to one particular classroom, at least not yet. Now, later in this context, you could then say the observational data because you've identified it already. So this is kind of a tricky thing. When I say post modifiers tend to make things more definite, it's not always the case, and this is one thing that's a little hard to explain. Because clearly in line 1, yes, it does. In line 3, not so clear. It's not really good with number 3. But you see, for example, in line 4, a 1-week trial. Trial is like this. It's a countable event and such. 2 and 3 shows a common problem. 2 and 3, cultural diversity and collectivism, individualism. Do these need articles? So I find this was a common problem. Individualism, collectivism, cultural diversity. These are abstract nouns, but I found that some Korean students repeatedly make this mistake of putting the on an abstract noun. In this case, there's no post modifier, or there's no identifying post modifier, there's no identifying phrase after it. It's just collectivism. So you don't really need a or the. Now, if any of you speak French, Spanish, German? Because in those languages you do put articles on abstract nouns. You would normally say in French or Spanish or German, the love, the collectivism, the feminism, but in English that only works if you've got a specific type or something. So for some reason, I'm not sure why, but the Korean writers typically make the mistake of putting the on a noun that is being used in a purely abstract sense, like here. And so I inserted articles. In the other places where I inserted articles, they're clearly a particular a particular object or event or such, or type of thing. At the bottom of page 3, the planning discipline, or discipline in this case is specific. Now let's move on to some more tricky issues with articles. There's more. Okay. You may have heard that we use the with something that's clearly identifiable, either from context or from our knowledge of the world. We say the sun, the moon. Because on this planet we only have one sun, we only have one moon. And so anytime you're just talking about the world, this is part of that's implied by our knowledge of the world. We have one sun, so we say the sun. Now, you could live on a different planet where you have two suns or two moons. So where there you have to specify it. Which moon? The moon is bright. Which one? Phobos, if you live on Mars. You know, Phobos is one of the moons of Mars. To say, which moon? Oh, Phobos is bright tonight. Or the big moon is bright tonight. The little moon is nowhere, but the big moon is bright tonight because Mars has a big moon and a little moon. Hopefully you know this if you pay attention to your science news. Anytime I'm talking about any kind of building or room, I don't have to first identify which floor I'm talking about. I just say there's something on the floor or the wall, because you know, it's just part of your mental knowledge of the world. Any building or room that you might be talking about has walls and floors and ceilings, so you don't need to specify first which one. You just say there's something on the floor or the wall, because all rooms have those things. If you live in an apartment where you don't have a ceiling, you really should talk to your landlord or floor. You may have heard about this in your grammar books, part of something. So if I'm talking about the computer, if then I refer to parts of it, I can still use the. So I'm talking about the computer. I opened up my computer and I took out the CPU and the hard drive and the SATA cables or the chipset or something, refer to specific parts of that. Where it's clear, I'm talking about the hard drive of this computer. Now, where that doesn't work and where Koreans might have trouble is if you're talking about maybe a group of things or people, and each one has an identity. So Koreans might say in English we say a litter of puppies. That's just the collective noun for puppies, a litter of puppies. And so a Korean might be writing about a litter or group of puppies born to one mother dog, and they'll say, the puppy. We go, which one? Because you haven't identified it. So if you're talking about like parts that are clearly identifiable, the CPU, the hard drive, that's clearly identifiable, that works. But if you're talking about a litter of puppies, where you have maybe 8 puppies, each is separate and has its own identity. And if you just say the puppy, you don't know which one unless you identify it first by saying the puppy with a spot on its eye or something like that. So that's a mistake that Koreans make with those kinds of expressions. Now, this one is not explained very well by your grammar books. This is common in narratives, but also in academic writing sometimes. There's a famous pop song you might know, in the jungle, in the mighty jungle, the lion sleeps tonight. The song starts like that. Do you know this song? Okay, some of you know, I can't sing it, but it's a famous pop song from the 70s or 60s, late 60s maybe. In the jungle, the mighty jungle, the lion sleeps tonight. The song starts like that. Which jungle? Which lion? Do you know which lion he's talking about? No. Like, oh yeah, he's the lion named Simba. He lives down the road from me. He ate my cat yesterday. I know him. No, it's not like that. You don't know which jungle. It's a hypothetical or what we call an exemplar. Sometimes in linguistics and psychology you call it an exemplar. That is a typical, some typical jungle and some typical lion. It's not one specific jungle, it's some typical or prototypical jungle. It could be any jungle. Some hypothetical jungle that maybe represents, you know, all typical jungles. And if you think of some typical lion, that is an exemplar or an example or representative of all typical lions. This is used in literature and in narratives, but you can also see it in academic writing. In the jungle, the lion sleeps tonight. So it starts out that way with these the. And in narratives, it just sounds more vivid. And sometimes we do this, you see this in narrative writing and also academic writing for topic shifts, to introduce a topic shift or a scene shift. So sometimes you'll notice writers do this. An example in literature might be, let's say you're reading a novel where the novel is describing maybe the road, and so you've got the scene in your mind of the road, and then suddenly the writer says, the mountains were covered with snow. The mountains, and the writer hasn't mentioned these mountains before, but is putting a on it instead of, oh look, there were some mountains, or we saw some mountains. They do a scene shift or a topic shift with the on the noun, and this sounds more vivid, more specific. And you might sometimes see this in academic writing. I don't have a good example, but I think I've seen it sometimes in academic writing, where in some cases it works to introduce a topic that the reader would understand, that the reader would clearly be able to infer or guess from the context. I'll let you come up with some examples. A similar thing, in English we say, I'm going to the store. You might say to your wife or husband, oh, I'm going to the store, I'm stepping out. Which store? Do they know which store specifically? No. Maybe you go to the same store regularly, or it's just some typical store, it's the store around the corner, whatever. They can probably guess it's this one or that one. But we say I'm going to the store. In English, American English especially, we say I'm going to the hospital, the doctor, and maybe you don't know which hospital. We just say that. It's this kind of thing again. It's a prototypical kind of hospital or doctor. Maybe it's the one I usually go to, but maybe I haven't been to the hospital before, but maybe it's just some typical hospital. Now something opposite is here. We say I'm going to school, or I'm at school. I'm going to, in American English we say I'm going to the hospital. In British they say I'm going to hospital, or I'm in hospital. It's different in British, different idiom. In American and British, I'm going to church, I'm going to school, I'm going to work. No article. Why? This is not explained very well in your grammar books. They just list these exceptions as exceptions, but that's confusing. Just like here, you have a distinction. Articles make something more specific, or at least seem more specific or vivid, even if it's kind of figuratively specific. If you use no article, it makes the meaning more abstract. So if you use no articles here, it makes the noun more abstract, especially in certain prepositional phrases. So if say I'm going to school rather than the school, it just sounds more general. School as a general type of place. I don't care which particular school, Kode, Kyangide, Uede, whatever, I'm just going to school. As a general type of place, a place where I study, or just the type of place where I go to class. In England, UK, they treat hospital as just a general type of place. Church, I'm going to mosque, I'm going to temple, whatever. Also here, I'm going by bus. So no article, because if I'm going by bus, do I care? Do you care which particular bus? No, it's not important generally. It's just bus as a type of transport. It's an abstract. So it's taking the noun and it's making it more abstract. The preposition, so you get a lot of these kinds of cases, preposition plus noun, no article, it just makes it more abstract. So I go to school by bus, I go to school by car, I go to school by helicopter, perhaps. And you see this a lot in academic writing. The satellite is in orbit. Where? You don't care which particular orbit. Is it an orbit at 100 kilometers, 102 kilometers? You don't care. It's just in orbit as a type of location. In So somebody asked, do native speakers have trouble with articles? No, it's generally something that we learn just as Koreans usually don't have trouble with, gee, on this noun, should I put ga or nun? Or e or nun, or ga or n? It's not usually a problem for Koreans. Just like for us, usually the choice of articles is not problematic. Yeah, there's some idiomatic differences between American and British, for example. The only problem that I can think of is really when you're learning the academic language of your field as a beginner, and you might encounter uses that are different from common English. So in common English, we might say that the children were speaking in a dialect. They weren't speaking standard Chinese, they were speaking in a dialect. But in linguistics, we say in dialect. We make it more abstract because in our world, dialect is not just, is something that we in linguistics can think of in a more abstract way. As it's like I'm speaking in French or German, or I'm speaking in dialect. Because I don't speak in a language, I speak in French or German, or I speak in dialect. And so in academic English, there's some special uses of nouns with or without articles, especially in prepositional phrases, for example, that are idiomatic to the writing of the field, to the writing and speaking of the particular field, because linguists think of dialect in a more abstract way than non-linguists. And so we use nouns in special ways in our fields. So in your field, you might have special ways where you use a noun more abstractly or more concretely, and have a more idiomatic usage of articles that's unique to your field. And those are some things you also have to learn. So that's basically my talk about articles. And articles, if you make mistakes with articles, that breaks the cohesion because the reader doesn't really know, is this noun something new or is this noun referring back to something previously in the context? And that's why, but sometimes you have a choice. Sometimes you can just express different nuances depending on, what you want to convey. So sometimes it's not right or wrong. Sometimes you can choose to use a noun with or without an article, and it just express different nuances. More often a kind of mistake I will see Koreans make, though, is if it's a count noun, they need to either put the on it, or they need to make it plural like this. So we did an experiment, the experiment, or we did experiments. And they'll sometimes just say we did experiment. They need to make it either specific or plural abstract. Another thing that has to do with cohesion is verb tense. We've kind of talked about this a little bit before. In writing, maybe expressing your own ideas, your own analysis, or when you are referring to past studies. In your field, do you use the present tense or do you use past tense? Because this varies a little bit from field to field or depending on context. If you use the present tense in your writing, if you're talking about your ideas or someone else's ideas, someone else's research, present tense or past tense? What's the difference? Past?
Present.
You use present, okay? And in what kinds of things are you talking about when you use the present tense?
When I describe my own idea,
Okay.
opinion, but I'm doing history, so if I'm talking about historical fact, then I have to use past tense. And
Okay. So you're going to switch back and forth. You're talking about historical facts in the simple past, but then you go to the present to talk about maybe your interpretation, your theory. So the present tense is talking about general facts or theories. This is my analysis, this is my theory, this is my interpretation, because it's a statement of it's a tense for general statements, either factual or theoretical, like interpretation, analysis. This is my interpretation, this is my analysis. Or this is someone else's interpretation and analysis. They claim that. They postulate that and such. And so the past tense, if you're talking about past events, or if you're doing literature review, you may talk about so-and-so did the study and they found, reported such and such, but then you might switch to present to talk about this is what, as a result, this is what we know in the field. Our general knowledge is that this is true, or according to our theory, this is the case, we believe this. So you might switch back and forth. Past tense maybe to talk about someone else's studies, especially if it's experimental studies. But in other fields, you might be dealing with some other scholar, you might be dealing with more theoretical stuff. Somebody proposed this, and so maybe you refer to their research in the present tense if it's more like ideas or theories. This is someone's theory, this is someone else's theory, he postulates this, she argues that, she argues for this. So when you move into the realm of current knowledge or theory or fact, you'll use the present tense. What's tricky, of course, is the perfect tense. We talked about this before, and there's a summary of tenses. There's another handout on the website that gives a little bit more information about the perfect tense. We have found, or they have found. So if you're reporting results, we have found this. And you use the perfect tense because it's then tied directly to something that's relevant. We have found that blah, 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 which is cool because it proves our hypothesis. So you might use the perfect tense because maybe this finding from our experiment proves this hypothesis. We have found that. So the perfect tense implies a connection to the present. When you're doing your lit review, they have found that. Why? Because their findings directly relate to maybe your study, your experiment, the rationale for your study, why are you doing your research. So if there's a direct connection between someone else's findings, writers will use the perfect tense because there's a direct connection between their findings or their claims. They have claimed that, they reported that, and my experiment is going to be based on that, or my experiment is going to try to prove them wrong, or studies have failed to explain this, but my study is going to explain it. And so you use the perfect tense to draw a direct connection between past work or findings or something that's just been done in your own. There's a last section on a word structure, on a word choice on page 6 and such. Some of these I've talked about before, so I'm not going to go through all of these, but there is a handout I'm going to show you on the website. I think we talked about some of these before. A lot of these are common Konglish errors. Modal verbs, you know, we could conduct the experiment. That's hypothetical, which is different from we were able to perform the experiment or we did perform the experiment. Light verbs, these are really common high frequency verbs. They're good for speaking, but for writing you want to use more specific verbs. Instead of get or give or have, try to use more specific verbs. Phrasal verbs tend to be more informal. In academic writing we prefer single word verbs that come from Latin. There are handouts on the website actually that talk more about some of these. I think, did we talk about like examples like I'm boring? Do we talk about that before? Yeah. So you don't want to say I'm boring, it's I'm bored. That's explained actually in the booklet I will show you. We talked about that before. Koreans make mistakes with verbs like verbs of state or change of state, exist, increase, decrease. I think we talked about that. Noun usage, Konglish expressions. We talked about that when we were talking about presentations. Over the years I've collected a lot of these and I've created smaller individual handouts, a few of which are on the website. More recently I've put it all together into one big booklet. It's kind of a word choice booklet, and I'm going to just quickly show you, but you can go on the website and read this on your own because it's about 60 pages I think. It's really a collection of various past handouts that I put together and I've added some to it. So it's on word choice problems, particularly those that Korean writers have, and it's kind of subtitled the Anti-Konglish Booklet. So let me wake the computer up. And what is that doing there? Okay, So this is the booklet. You go on the website and word choice issues booklet. It's there. It actually includes some things from some of these other handouts. I put this together a few months ago. So for example, see clean blue crap, not crab, queso. At the Hu Moon, there is an Italian restaurant, and on their menu they have, the English says crap pasta, which doesn't sound very appetizing. And my favorite is restrooms that are just for one man, a man room, like only one man can go in there. This has a lot of these categories that are listed in the handout. Problems with nouns, some of these we talked about before. For example, equipment is singular, not equipment, not furnitures, things like that. Noun problems, pronoun issues that we talked about today, articles. Some of these verb forms I talked about. Formality, so some words are more formal. In Koreans, especially if you're just memorizing words from a book, you don't really come to learn which words are more formal, which are more informal. And there's a little section here on formal words, like besides is kind of informal, somewhere, things like that. Particularly collocation errors in Konglish expressions. We talked about this before. This is not a Y shirt, this is a dress shirt, for example, things like that. That's in this handout. So I've collected a number of these from the web. But collocation errors, collocation means words that are used together. And this is a common problem. If you're memorizing words from vocabulary books, you don't really realize or learn how words are used in context, what words they're used with. And this is a big problem. The only way to really learn is to do a lot of reading, where you encounter words in context, you learn their nuances, and what words they tend to be used with. So there are some cultural collocations. For example, how would you complete this? Salt and? Americans will say, or Westerners will say salt and pepper. Koreans will say salt and sugar. That's a cultural collocation. Some collocations are more abstract. For example, influence. So let's see, I think I have, yes, right here. We say not different than, but we say different from. Influence. We say, you don't say X influences on Y when it's a verb. You say has an influence on, but Koreans will make the mistake of saying X influences on Y. You don't use on with the verb, but if you're using the noun influence, then you say influence on, not to. So Koreans might make the mistake of saying influence to. We say influence on. And so a lot of these collocation problems, for example, are verb plus preposition, or the use of prepositions. Or likewise, when these prepositions get turned into parts of phrasal verbs, and the phrasal verbs are often idiomatic or metaphorical. So just like in Korean, you have compound verbs, like 버리다 is compounded, and you say 잊어버리다, where the 버리다 is no longer literally throwing away, but it's emphasizing, it intensifies the forget, 잊어버리다. My favorite, 죽어버리다, to really, I guess, I don't know how to translate that, to really die. It makes it more emphatic. It's metaphorical, because you'd have to use a slang or idiom like kick the bucket or croak. These prepositions, phrasal verbs are often metaphorical, and the metaphors differ from one language to another, which is why it's really hard to learn prepositional expressions in a different language, or with English, the phrasal verbs, because the phrasal verb parts are borrowed from prepositions, but they work in similar ways. Like over. Over is a motion event like this, something's going over something. So you can kind of look at the top part here, where like being physically over something, and you get metaphors from that. And you say, I'm over a company of 500 employees, meaning power or authority. That comes metaphorically from this idea of being on top of something. Or something is finished, so the motion of going over and finishing. And so we get metaphors for that. What do you say to your ex-boyfriend? Don't call me anymore, I'm over you. In other words, finished, emotionally finished, it's complete. Or, the test is over, it's finished. Or do it over and over, repeatedly. And these are really tricky for especially Asians, where the prepositional metaphors are just very different. And so I've got a list of some common kinds of collocational errors. Many of them are verb plus preposition combinations, which are really hard. So like back to influence on, there's a metaphor. It's like influence is like a force acting on an object or on a surface. There's a metaphor behind it to have an influence on something. And this kind of stuff is really hard to learn. And if you're just learning words from vocabulary books, it's impossible to learn this kind of information. You can only learn it from doing a lot of reading and other forms of input, giving your brain a lot of input through reading regularly, consistently, every day, every week, month after month, year after year, as well as exposing yourself to media materials, perhaps. As we talked about on I think the first session of this series, and when possible, speaking or writing practice. But this has, and I will probably have to add to this later because there are a lot more. But I have these two books here, the Oxford Phrasal Verb Dictionary. For example, is pretty nice, by the way, because it's the same patterns whether, for example, over, above, whether they're used as a pure preposition or as a phrasal verb like get over. They have pretty much the same kind of metaphorical meanings. The back of the Oxford Phrasal Verb Dictionary has a nice appendix where it breaks down the main different meanings, like what are the meanings of over as a phrasal verb, and it also applies to over as a preposition pretty much. So because as a phrasal verb like get over, it's just kind of like the preposition over, like I'm over the company and such. So the appendix has a nice breakdown of the common meanings, the common metaphorical meanings of these items like over, about, of, up, down, and such. At least the more common ones. So the booklet on word choice issues, yes, it's 60 pages, and I will probably add to it later on, but that's a free booklet on the website for you, and there are a few other handouts on the website. I've got this short handout on articles. It kind of gives a classification of the basic system here. Then I've got a longer handout, that goes more into some of the more special cases that we talked about over there. And that's on the website too. And again, it's not perfect, it's not complete. There are some things that are still not clear, like with post modifiers, which usually but not always make something definite enough to take an article. Still working on that, but I hope to do more research and develop also some more teaching and learning materials in the future. So again, check back maybe in a year or 2 years and maybe I'll have more stuff there. Okay, so that is all for now. And our last session is this afternoon, where we'll be talking about using sources in your writing. Okay, thanks.